This is chapter 4 of Living Faithfully in Fragmented World. This chapter is not in the original book.
I can see one.
And I think this chapter, honestly, I have several question marks through it, like not just what are you saying, like this doesn't even make sense to me. To the extent, that's okay. That's okay. We're with you. It's a little. Now it's a little too much. Now you've crossed the threshold.
I kept it with me because
10 seconds was okay, but once you get past that, then it's just rude. Oh, or just kidding. She knows that. No, you're fine. No, I am actually, after we finish this study, I'm going to write the publisher and say that I think they're actually, there's a lot of good meat in this, and it is completely cluttered by a lot of the new monastic stuff. And I'm very disappointed to the extent that I'm going to write them and say, this needs to still be available because I could not, and I'm going to refrain my writing, but I am going to actually write, Jonathan Wilson's up at Vancouver School of Theology in Vancouver, BC. So I'm going to write him and encourage him to rethink some of, because it's just, anyway, all that's to say is if you had trouble with this week, it's not surprising because none of it makes sense.
What happened to his writing style between that one and this one?
Complete, it's almost like he doesn't know how to write anymore.
I know.
Did you feel the writing difference? It just felt clunky and wordy and forced.
It's vague generalization. I used to teach writing. I'm critical of writing style, but it's so vague and it's general. You can't get to a point. And
even if you know the arguments behind all the discussions that are happening, it's still there. He's putting things together. I have good question marks, and then I got to the end of it, and I'm just like, what on earth is this chapter? The next one, I can promise you, will be much better because I read it last night and it's exciting. But unfortunately, what's that?
It made sense.
It made this just, this, if I could pull up to sort of a 50,000 foot narrative, this chapter, just even the resisting Nietzschean temptation. Mm-hmm. I think what he's doing here is he's addressing, and if you saw towards the end of the chapter, he mentions it with relationship to media and new monasticism. Have you heard of names of like Shane Claiborne? Then they ring a bell at all. He was a huge thing probably in the first part of the 2000s. He's a dreadlock wearer. He's in Philadelphia. He has an intentional community there. Rutba House, the Jonathan Wilson's son. Jesus people, there were intentional communities that sort of rose, and then there were this new monastic expression. Again, I said at the very beginning, came alongside this emergent Christianity that kind of came out in the early 2000s. And emergent Christianity was a bunch of Gen Xers who were raised in mainline churches like Presbyterian, Episcopalian, and they were like, we're tired of just sort of the dead church. We want to take the theology, which is one of the sort of more robust parts of the mainline church compared to the evangelical churches. Theology tends to be hardier, and they wanted to put it in more of an expressive, alternative, explorative, innovative type of style of worship that it wasn't defined by tradition, but the theology still came with them.
But it was just worship.
It was mostly around worship. You could say the preaching was, it's better preaching, but it's more like, the big, I should show you the video after if you want to remind me, and I'll pull it up. But there's a video called Contemporvent.
Called what?
Contemporvent. It's like relevant and contemporary smushed together, and it mocks the whole emerging church movement. And and it will mock me because it talks about people with cool glasses and and tattoos with arms open wide, and so it sort of mocks it's funny, it mocks our generation. I never really liked the emerging church because it was a little bit too faddish, and because monasticism and the history of Christian practices are something that I have studied and taken seriously, and don't look at as a gimmick to revitalize the church. but I see them as practices that were meant to embrace on a more daily, habitual, like, Lectio Divina. You've heard of Lectio Divina, reading scripture slowly and listening and reading it again. That's something monks did for centuries. We do it like in a Sunday school for 15 minutes before we just piece and parcel everything from church history that we like. We'll throw a labyrinth out and walk a labyrinth. Well, labyrinths were at a time where labyrinth service at a time where people couldn't travel because it was too dangerous, and you would be, maybe because people made pilgrimages to Rome or to Jerusalem or to other holy cities. But they started building labyrinths, so they walked in them. So they had a historic, kind of what he's saying. A labyrinth has a historic significance to the time that there's always been labyrinths, but the use of this is the center of a labyrinth. It's the big Chartreuse labyrinth in France. And those came out at a time where in Europe, pilgrimages were on the rise, but safety was not possible. And because so much of one's spirituality was determined or expected to embrace these practices, like pilgrimage, churches began building labyrinths so people could show spiritual devotion in their home setting. Well, nowadays we roll them up onto vinyl and send them all over the country so people can have them at conferences, and they still work. They're still good. They're meditative. They have some contemplative quality to them, but they're a fragment of the historical reason why labyrinths entered the church as a practice in Christianity. But all that's to say is a lot of the things that even new monasticism we see coming up are these gimmicks or flashy things, and they're drawing attention because everyone's looking for a new way to be the church. What's the next thing? What's the biggest? It's like, how do you compete with the youth group down the road when they have a wall of 20 screens and video games and lights and hot dog machine, and all these gadgets? Everyone wants to go down there. So small churches like, we can't compete with that. So this is like embracing this idea that being, and he talks about this being managing culture. Social sciences would say, draw kids in and they'll want to be there. But what he's saying here in terms of this is really that new monasticism was put under the spotlight. It was on the cover of Christianity Today and Christian Century. It's been, there's been lots of interviews and articles and podcasts and conferences around new monasticism. And the challenge of that is at the heart of monasticism and the heart of new monasticism, there wouldn't be self-promotion. You wouldn't be going out doing all these interviews. There would be just a different way. And I think what Jonathan Wilson is trying to do is he's trying to take this original work, which I think is brilliant, and he's trying to apply it to a movement that he is a part of on the fringe, probably one of the more sort of scholarly sources for them. And so he's really writing to a very specific audience. And it does say, from after to new monasticism, but I guess, to be honest with you, I didn't even notice that it said new monasticism. I just looked at Living Faithfully and saw that it was a new edition, because you can't get that one. So what he's doing is he's addressing the idea of those who want to develop new monastic communities. So a little bit of the lens of that will help you digest it. But I found myself writing CPC over new monasticism to see if it fit. And in some places, it actually shed some light. So I think we should work through it and we'll talk about it. And it does, in some ways, give you a little bit of a foreshadowing of what he's going to, what he's going to talk about next, and what he just thought. It does bridge it in the sense he's using Nietzsche, that Nietzschean. You all were here last week. Were you here last week? Let me give you just a summary. Basically, when he's talking about Nietzschean morality, he's saying basically from Christ up to about the 16th century, morality was defined by the church. And even if it was a fragment of what was back there, it was defined in much way because the church and the state were synonymous. And within that worldview, prior to the 16th century, there were three things that you ultimately had to sort of answer. Where am I? Or, who am I in this the sense of description? Where am I going? And this is what he talked about, the word telos, meaning end. The teleology is the end of something. So who am I? Where am I going? And then the practical question is, how do I get there? So who am I? Where am I going? What's my goal? What's my purpose? And how do I get there? And so morality was in service of that telos, that goal, that aim for humanity. And for prior to the 16th century, that aim was to glorify God and delight in him. That's the end of humanity. The purpose, the chief end, it's in a lot of our catechisms, the chief end of man is to glorify God and to delight in him. So at the 16th century, what he says is, around the beginning of the Enlightenment, you have all these Descartes, Hume, and Kant, and they are rejecting this state-instituted Christian morality and saying there has to be something beneath Christianity. And so they decide to try to define morality based on rationality. So what is rational defines what is moral. Makes sense? Like, is it nice to do something to someone? Is it nice for me to, poke Mary with my pencil? No. Well, rationally would say, I don't want someone to do that to me. You don't want someone to do that to me. And that's a Judeo-Christian value. But in this instance, Immanuel Kant would have said there's what he calls a moral imperative inside of us, which I would call the spirit, that would say, that's not really right. That puts me against you. I'm not going to do that. But what Kant is trying to do in Hume is they're trying to put the argument for morality beneath or as foundational to Christianity, Christian morality. They're trying to make the Christian perspective subservient to a general human rationality. From a Christian perspective, we would argue that human rationality comes from the Holy Spirit and is reinstated in us in Pentecost. And so we're seeing the fruition of that over the last 2,000 years. And it may be in the sense of even the 17th century when Kant's saying, okay, well, it's from some sense of rationality. Now, that's the sort of background of what he's talking about. And I'm just going to go through because I want to there's a couple great points that I think we can learn. It's not really, at some point it doesn't really make sense to go too deeply into the rational, non-rational. And I think once we hear his moral proposal next week, in terms of what is in a Christian, almost a Christian Aristotelian perspective, will make sense. It'll bring everything together. It's going to, and it will, because you're not getting the negative, because right now he said, this is what's happened. Here's the negative. Oh, and so the other side of that, I didn't say about last week, I said last week, was that because of this structure of trying to define morality by rationality, when there's a breakdown in whatever is agreed upon rationality over this time, then all of a sudden, the only way we have to judge what is right and wrong is by our own experience. So it's my experience of, and that's often defined by culture. I don't think we individually ever are sort of isolated in our decisions. We're always a product of our culture. But what I'm saying is that at some point you have to decide, to use the example we talked about last week, if a naked man walked in the room, would you feel offended?
Here?
Well, there you go. It's happened here before. I thought we weren't going to talk about that.
It depends on if it's town seller, Yeah, exactly.
But what we were saying is that there's an immediate emotional reaction to that. So the question being, why is cannibalism wrong? Why does that give you a feeling of detest? And that's moral wrong. Why? We eat all this other flesh. If you're in a place that you need to eat someone else, why would in other words, we don't think through a basis of why is this wrong? We just have a sense of disgust for it and say it's wrong. Well, where this breaks down is really generationally. When morals are not passed down generationally and culturally, then we have an entire generation of millennials who don't know how to understand themselves and make decisions in a moral way beyond their feelings emotionally about something. Make sense?
Yep.
Before, it was defined by the culture. You parented like your parents. And there's abuse that happened there. So I'm not saying that was a great system, but I'm saying that you knew what was expected. Now you don't know what's expected. You get these kids raising, and because of mobility, they're flying all over the place. They're 25 years old. They have a kid. They don't have a multi-generational tier family and community support around them. So how do they know what to do? They don't. They have no clue.
Moral moral relativism.
Moral relativism. So we know what we do as a generation. It started, we're the YouTube generation. It started with the Gen Xers. We go on YouTube. I don't know how to do something. I don't have, my parent never showed me. I don't really feel close to my parent. Maybe they don't know. I'll go watch a couple of videos on YouTube and give it a go. Which can hold that concept, because that idea of the surrogate parent being a video will play into next week when we talk about the notion of excellence. Because I can watch 3 videos and tile a floor, but what I don't have is a community or a mentor around me to say, no, you want to do a little bit like this because I've done it for 20 years and I know how to do this, and this is how you pass down a practice of tiling that is characterized by excellent tiling, as opposed to me just putting piecemeal together. All that's to say is, if you don't have anything to stand for, you are only standing against things.
But is it the same with the physical skill as with moral judgment?
In essence, yes. I mean, in terms of
moral
past
judgments from YouTube, do you?
to some extent, I would say media. I mean, I think much of it. I mean, look how strong Facebook is in shaping national narrative. It may not be a YouTube video, but it's someone mediating something that is not part of your, maybe not part of your community, maybe. And so all that's to say is, when McIntyre wrote this, we had no concept of the internet and the widespread nature of it. Like that's been, so what he says on this chapter, we're just going to walk through it. So he says, resisting, starting at page 38. He says that he's going to look back at Aristotle and he's going to make a Christian version of Aristotle. He Christianizes it, he looks at that through Christ. And so that first thing is kind of like, and then he basically says, these are we're going to go into the reasons. This is the last, second paragraph, last sentence. In this chapter, we explore the Nietzschean path to discern its temptations and the ways that we may indeed stray onto this path as a result of our own history with modernity. So he's going to talk about modernity, which is the period between 1750 up to the 1950s, where science and reason and the scientific method and absolutes, things were black and white, morals were defined by society. Everyone abided to them. If you were outside of those morals, you were outside the bubble. Those were the things that sort of define the modern era. Well, in the 60s and 70s, things changed, and now we have moral relativity. And so that's the era of postmodernity. Postmodernity is just, I think, really going to ultimately be a place taker for, we don't know what the next era is, but it's saying we no longer are in a society that agrees that there is one morality that exists. We all have our own little sacred umbrellas that we're walking around with and living our own little judgment, lives of judgment. So he says there's 2 ways that this temptation to toy with this come into, and you don't really, he'll go into more detail, but one was to reduce all morality, to reduce everything to morality, that all society boils down to the basic ethic of what you believe is right and wrong, which I don't think he communicated clearly, because to some extent that you'll find in the next chapter, he actually claims as truth. And so I think it was confusing how he was claiming that. And then 2, a reduction of the will to power. And really what he means by that is that in our society, morality or decision-making or ethical choices boil down to power differentials. And if you want to have power, then your morality is shaped by the desire for power. And you'll make choices because there's a desire to
Or compromises.
It happens both ways. Absolutely. So basically, to think of, so he's saying that everything is about morality is a modernist perspective. And you're going to hear this, and probably if for the older generations, this is going to be the cry of go back to the day when everything just made sense and everyone was on the same page, and the good old days where you didn't have to discuss topics and controversy of whether they're right or wrong. It's just people didn't do it. And so that is that sense of reducing everything with who we are into an expression of morality. Now, not surprisingly, what did we see in the 60s and 70s? That was an overthrow of power. Women's rights, power. Racial, civil rights sort of thing, equality, power. Rich, poor, power. Banking, power. Internet information, who controls it, power. Even, I was trying to play a Today chant on my phone the other day, and it said I can't, because I bought a digital version of it today, Today chant, and I have to wait 30 or 60 days or something until my new phone, because they're both in the, and I was like, are you kidding me? I paid for the, Apple has power over me. This, it is, and this is, and so we are in an age where we're no longer boiling things down to morality, because our moralities are different. We're boiling down to an ethic of power or a chance to control. So that's what, and that I will say was one of the nuggets that I did think was valuable about this, because I think we see it in the church. I mean, forget society as a whole. I think we see some of these things in church. So he starts the first temptation as being morality. And he says, out of that breakdown of that sense of universal morality, that leaves a gap basically for power to fill. Were you going to say something here? Were you going to say something? No. Okay.
So is he condemning those movements, the power? Because if people have been denied power, isn't it justice that they be given more power over their lives?
The question becomes, and McIntyre, the one who wrote After Virtue, also wrote a book that's fascinating. I've never made it through it though, but I have a great article on it by Tim Keller if you want it. But McIntyre wrote a book called Whose Justice, Whose Rationale, or Whose Reason. I'm dropping the name of it. But the idea behind it was the very notion of justice is not universally agreed upon. Like, there's an assumption in many groups in particular that pursue issues of justice that everyone shares that common view. But what he does is he goes through and he basically makes a typology of justice in the world, and philosophically how we view these things, and explains how we got to the place where how we see justice is very different. Because we could and we ought to somehow define it by biblical justice, but even biblical justice is penal, and God was punishing people. And honestly, if those of you who've been in the Bible study this will be, and we looked at all this, there's a lack of feeling of justice in Scripture all over the place, and sometimes at the hand of God. So there comes a place where justice becomes this question of what does it mean? How do we apply it? And so you can get small clusters of people who have a common shared view of justice, and they are actually effective in maybe what they're doing in the world because they're clustering. And that ultimately what you can say is that you get a small group of people who believe the same thing and decide where the essentials are and how they're going to support those essentials. And they make those things that they do better for the life of the community, then eventually you start to see excellence rise within the community. And, where good things happen, good things continue to happen usually. But so he says, so first temptation, he says some Jubilee Journal, and then he says the last sentence of that first paragraph of first temptation. That is, if there is no reasons for one morality, then morality is simply an expression of the will. And I think that sort of characterizes when we have this earlier to glorify God as the purpose of humanity, we have a reason for morality. And our morality is measured by its extent to which we glorify God and delight in Him in our expression of morality. The minute you take that end goal off, and morality is for the morality's sake itself, then he's saying that basically it becomes down to an expression of one's will. Because you may think something is moral, but I may disagree with you. I play poker. Some people in the church may think that's an immoral thing that I'm doing. I disagree with you. Hopefully not.
Since we do too.
Yeah.
It's a game.
We're not
It's
justifying it.
fellowship.
You don't have to justify it.
Yeah.
No.
I mean,
Doesn't morality come down to loving your neighbor?
In a Christian ethic, yes. And what Kant would say is actually the loving your neighbor is a much deeper, and I understand where he's coming from, is you look at world religions. Islam in its purest, non-adulterated sense is exactly the same. Love God, love your neighbor. Judaism, same. Christianity, same. Buddhism, essentially the same. It's not God, love the universe and love your neighbor. Every major religion seeks peace. There's always deviant groups that represent it inappropriately or are fragments of the original. So what Kant's saying, or these moral ethicists would say, is that there's a baseline that exists underneath. Now, we as Christians claim Christ is the way, the truth, and the light. Therefore, we would claim that upon the arrival of the Holy Spirit, that it gave us if you will, a morality of spirit, that we are driven by the ethic of love for God and love for neighbor. But that was not something that came easy prior to the Spirit. Prior to the Spirit, it was like, you got to teach that Jeremiah 31, you no longer have to teach your neighbor teach your neighbor the law, because the law will be written within. Well, so that means that prior to Christ, they were having to say to their kids, you're not really supposed to murder people. It's just, it's kind of a bad thing. I know it goes against your instincts, because our instincts would be, if someone in a system did something bad to us, we would take, retributive action toward them. But then Jesus arrives on the scene, this upside down kingdom, and says, actually, the ethic is reversed. In weakness, we will see strength, because in that act, it acknowledges that there's way more in the world than we see in our physical eyes. There are spirits around us. There are spirits, we have a spirit in us. We are spirit beings. And the acknowledgement of that world is what says, this world, and this is where you get in the Old New Testament thing of sharing things and caring for your neighbors. And because there's a sense of, again, if we knew we had a year left, we would live differently. So, I would.
Would you would?
Probably.
You play more poker?
Probably play a lot more poker.
Yeah.
I would still play games,
Yes.
because God designed us to delight. So he says there's two temptations. To reduce everything to mere morality is powerful for two reasons. So in other words, our desire to basically make everything just about what you believe, right or wrong. Practices, and he doesn't really go into this, but and he says it's, the practices, and I was like, okay, he's getting somewhere with it, but he never, and I wrote down, it makes no sense. But our practice, this goes back to the Aristotelian Platonic thing, where if I speak on Sunday morning, preach and give you right doctrine, good orthodox doctrine, and you listen to that, and I think of the older generation still have some mentality that if someone in a knowledge authority position says something that sounds right and sounds reasonable, then you should try to integrate that in somehow of your life, and it should affect how you behave. This is a Platonic notion. If you think about what is good, it will affect your action to do good. But the problem with that in the schema is, if your good is a non-Christian or non-Christ oriented morality, that then boils down to what he's saying, to basically the whim of your will or your emotions, then it falls, because your ideal is wrong or off, and you have no community to champion that ideal. Now, I have a community of scholars around me that say that the ideas that I'm sharing are okay. So it's not the same way, but in our modern day society, you can be an internet sensation and you command more and have more influence over people than, and you could have, it's kind of one of those things that there's no tradition around that. We have seen the degradation of knowledge over the last 20 years in a way that is shocking. For example, remember back when MySpace was out there, people put up their stuff. That was sort of the beginning of a then we had blogs. Before that, there were news boards. People would write these big lengthy things and you participated in news board, and it was just text. Well, then we had blogs, and I remember when people started putting pictures in blogs. Oh, it'll jazz it up. It catches. But you get pictures in blogs. So what happens is you get these long news feeds that you can read, and now you get them in chunks with a picture, then a picture. And then then actually it shifted to Facebook, and Facebook was like, you can't put a long post on Facebook. It's got to be a short post with a link to something else maybe. But Facebook shrunk it. At the same time, Facebook was gaining popularity, same thing with Twitter. What is Twitter? 40 characters, that's it. So what happened when Twitter became popular? We destroyed spelling and grammar so that we could shrink it. And then that didn't, and if that just stayed as a medium for tweeting, that would be one thing. But what happened is it got to the place where now people communicate through Twitter. They follow people through Twitter. They just want this little teeny soundbite. And you know what now we are at? You know what the youngest generation uses? Snapchat. And it has almost no words on it. It's pictorially based, and the words that are spelled on it are often blaring in your face and misspelled. You are watching the degradation of the English language and our use of it in Western culture because of social media.
Well, that they did away with handwriting.
Exactly. So anyway, all that's to say is all that ideal down to practice boils down to whatever you feel like, because your ideals are going to be different. Now, McIntyre argues that there is goodness, true goodness that comes from the Spirit and when we experience that in practice, and I can't think of any better way than to say right now, the hiker meal has been one of those instances where when you participate in that, you physically can feel the good that is there. And if we as a community are always engaging in those practices that we communally experience as good and that resonate with the scriptures, then that over time develops our belief. And so it's reversed. Instead of to know good is to do good, it is doing good is to know good. And what he's going to argue is that we've lost communities of practice that together form their identity and who they are by doing good, and therefore form their belief system, which then becomes sort of this reciprocal.
Doesn't it go both ways though?
It does to some extent, but the challenge that he would say is that we're in such a fragmented society and we're so used to appealing to the voice or the knowledge of the expert that we just take it because it's easier. It's easier to just take what someone else says than to wrestle with it and to embody it. So that's kind of what he's talking about on that page.
We're having so much trouble, like on the news and all that, somebody says this and somebody says that, and people are believing them and nobody's thinking.
No one thinks.
I mean, it's like,
Well, that's what we saw during the election, regardless of which side one was on. Everyone towed party lines. And sometimes the party lines, if you actually looked at on both sides, looked at the arguments they were presented, and you're like, this doesn't really make sense.
Yeah.
But the challenge is we live in such a divisive society. It was kind of like we experienced tribalism over the last few years of people grouping together, not because of the actions that they take as a community, but because perceived beliefs. And the challenge of that is the minute you no longer think that might be true because of an emotional reaction, you disconnect yourself from a community and find another one that matches. And if you can't, then you're just floating around.
Well, that's why it's important to view both sides.
Absolutely. What do you say?
That's my wine guy for the wine and music.
Gotcha.
And he did.
No, go for it. So good on page 40, at the top, he's talking about all life cannot be reduced to morality. And he's addressing that issue. And then kind of some of those things that I just talked about, the fact that thought leads to action. If you go about halfway down that first paragraph, or this, I guess the second full paragraph, third paragraph total. It starts with the for church, but truly halfway down it says, it is not that we have beliefs or doctrines that are necessary for our faith and actions or ethics that are optional. In other words, there are things that you can't, we can't claim that we have these beliefs and not have actions that are connected to it. If we understand our beliefs and doctrines properly, they also entail actions and ethics. And so that's the reciprocal loop. But, and here's the thing, is we're not going to just start with a random action, but in some sense, hospitality hyper, that's an action, that's practice. We were saying we're going to show hospitality. We didn't really know what we were doing. We're kind of muddling our way through it. But what we're seeing is goodness expressed through it. And that is beginning to shape people's belief systems about hikers. The amount of people each week you come up to me and say, I took a hiker up to the pass and they're so proud of themselves and excited. And I'm delighted too, because it means that they have seen something and experienced something that is changing the way they behave. and ultimately changing how they think about abuse, saying, oh, they are okay. They're not vagrants. They are stinky. But if I roll my window down, I can mediate them. The bottom of this, it goes down about almost to the, right before it says the second season. That says we must not lose sight of the conviction that we are seeking to recover our life as disciples of Jesus Christ, precisely in order to witness to him as the way, the truth, and the life. And I think that's important because sometimes, and what he's arguing against is the idea that when morality becomes the agenda of the church, then we lose sight of the proclamation of the gospel. Because then again, you could say, whose morality? Well, we get in a society where that's all over the place. Even in this room, we have, over half a dozen different moralities that may or may not line up. But if we're aligned and and understand this in relationship to the gospel, then it unifies us. What did I write down?
So then we do start with a belief that leads to an action.
Yes. In other words, I wrote it, we're not moral. We're not moral people for morality's sake, as if there's some ideal of morality, we should just be good people. We're moral, where we make decisions because our identity has been purchased by Christ, defined by Christ.
But aren't we moral sometimes? If you, let's say you're not a Christian, but you've been raised in a good family, and that family set morals for you. It's the same thing.
It is, and then the larger picture of that is that even that morality that they're probably raising their kid in is a Judeo-Christian morality.
Yes.
Probably. You're probably.
And so, that's why it was an amazing book somewhere, I don't know, but it was basically the argument of the whole book was you can't separate Western morality from Judeo-Christian morality. To even try to assert would be to ignore history. But that's an expression of the Enlightenment project that says, oh no, I can find morality outside of Christianity, but we don't claim that as Christians. And I think, taking kids on mission trips for decades, so when I started in the Assemblies of God doing missions trips, I would go to like Argentina and we'd help a missionary, or Venezuela or Jamaica. We were all, Detroit. We'd go help a mission that already existed. But the purpose for us going was we were in VBS, we were in some sort of proclamation of the gospel. Even if you're building something, you're trying to show Christ's love. And I think the challenge is there are so many churches these days that will take their kids on youth group trips and work with Habitat for Humanity, fantastic organization, but they really don't, they're just going on a trip, doing a good thing. So what he's saying is that mission trip, that service trip is prompted by general morality, not by an identity of who Christ Jesus is and who we are. Yeah.
But if my motive is to serve God through Habitat for Humanity, and I'm clear about that as my
Oh,
motive,
then you're good to go.
I can't-
Absolutely, there's nothing wrong with Habitat for Humanity. Let's just be clear. I
And
love
in-
Habitat.
In my heart, I'm saying, I'm doing this for God and for my neighbor. Then what's wrong with our joining other efforts or, like,
Nothing. No, that's perfect.
But shouldn't you verbalize that to the kids?
Well,
Yes.
Taking on these trips,
Yes.
this is why we're doing this.
well, yes, and I think that's my point is that you want a young person to go serve others with the mindset of this is the mission of God I'm proclaiming.
Yes.
Not, it's just a good thing to go build houses and paint stuff. Well, you don't have to be a Christian to do that. You don't have to be a Christian to serve in a soup kitchen. You don't have to be a Christian to none of those things require faith whatsoever. They require a general sense of morality, which again goes to the Holy Spirit. But what he's saying is that the church, if the church is just doing stuff for moral reasons, then we have aligned our values to general morality rather than
it all comes down to motive.
Well,
some
What's your
intentionality.
when you
Absolutely.
say when a church is doing only moral things, give me an example?
I'm saying in his service, like they're doing soup kitchens, they're or
Sandwiches.
making sandwiches, they're going on missions trips, they're giving their money to, working with agencies, they're, even serving their, I mean, and I think that that internally, sometimes it's easier to have a Christian, who we wash each other's feet mentality. But when we go outside the boundaries of the church, the question becomes, why are we doing this? Well, some people are, we become in such a privatized place, and he talks a little about that, the privatization of our own faith, because it's personal, that we have almost shifted to a place where our acts of justice and our acts of mercy are defined not out of, I'm sharing Christ's love, but I just want to be a good person. And I think honestly, like, I'm not for, the pastors have said, we're going to pray before the hiker mail. I said, no, we don't. I think we show Christ. We don't have to say anything about Jesus. They know we're Christians. They know we're a church. And in many ways, by not saying something to them, we're welcoming them and showing them hospitality, because we don't expect anything from them. One of the biggest things, so Andy Root was one of my colleagues from seminary, and he's a PhD in Lutheran seminary, prolific writer. Since graduating, he's written a book a year all across the board, all sorts of things. But one of the books that he wrote was about the idea of the evangelical expression of youth ministry that says that in Young Life in particular, and Young Life is not intended this way. Their mission statements, those things are tight and good. It doesn't always express itself that way. Was, I'm going to befriend you, and I want to hang out with you because I like you, because I want you to be like me and find Jesus. And so the minute I engage in ministry to Mary, I have an agenda. And what he talks about is when Christ, is the idea of place sharing, when you just sit with somebody. In other words, I'm going to sit with you and befriend you, not because I hope that you become, I would hope that you become a Christian, but not because I have an agenda to save you or to win you over or to help you be a part of our church, but because I just want to befriend you and journey with you. That is a very different, one has an agenda, one just says, I want to dwell with you because of who you are. And he makes the argument that this is what Jesus did. Jesus didn't, we have no record of Jesus going into the bars and when he hung out with prostitutes and tax collectors and drunkards. And he didn't go, there's no record of him going in there proclaiming the good news in these areas. We just know that he spent time with these people. And he proclaimed the news generally. And we as a church, we're not hiding the fact that we're Christians. But sometimes, it's kind of like, in a year and a half here, I have a very diverse gaming circle of people. We play games. I'm not hanging out with, I don't want to name individuals because I don't want to isolate them, but I'm not hanging out with, there are many non-Christians that have joined us. I'm not playing games with them because I want them to become a Christian. I'm playing games with them because I want them to experience the love of Christ through me as a human being. And I think that's happening. And I think that sense of love can come through, and that mission can be proclaimed without it being in someone's face. But I also think that if I'm just playing games and I'm just doing it as a person, then we're just playing games. But I don't. I see everything we do as a mission, as a ministry, as a way.
But I see that as more successful that way, as opposed to trying to get into somebody's face.
Well, because we know, even, like we said, 67% Billy Graham retention rate is, how many of our evangelical efforts to go out there and proclaim the gospel end up, on the cutting room floor, not really producing. I think VBS is great. I think it should be intergenerational. I think it could be all church. I think it should just be like a retreat for the church. 1 week we all gather together. I think the whole notion of VBS for kids, get all the neighborhood kids come in is kind of stupid, quite frankly. And I think it actually is a fragment of the proclamation of the gospel, because we think if we put on this great show that we can get all the neighborhood kids in, and then we can get their parents to come see them sing on Sunday, that somehow the parents are like, oh, did you see Sally sing up there today? She was so precious. We should join this church and give money to it. Like, it's just, but I cannot tell you that is the mentality. That's, but what we need to do is say Vacation Bible School should be a retreat for a community to say, what, for this week, we're going to put aside our normal things that we do, and we're going to gather together for a couple hours each day. We're going to eat together. We're going to learn together. We're going to sing together. We're going to grow together, because we know that intentional practice of retreat, of gathering together, will form us as a community. not because it's going to grow our church or make us look better in front of other people. And that's that fragmentation. The last thing he says on page 40 is morality basically has the power to divide or unite. The gospel gives us our purpose in that. And so if we share that, it can unite us. If we share that sense of Christian or Christ-centered morality, then that becomes a uniting thing. What we're seeing right now is the fragmented moralities that we see are causing division in our culture, politically, socially, racially, across the board, we're seeing things break down. Top of page 41, this is where his sort of new monasticism thing. I wrote, my summary was public Christianity becomes more about finding a shared morality than living out the gospel. Service without Christ is public morality, is what he's saying. Our morality that we live out in public. If we're just being a good person and a decent, and at one time being a good Christian and a good citizen were the same thing. If you were a good Christian, you were a good citizen. If you were a good citizen, you'd be a good Christian. That's just the way society operated. But we now live in a time where that sense of public morality, if it's just there about, and what he's arguing against in this is, if the church is just trying to create a public morality, then we've lost the sense of the gospel. Because we're meant to stand, over and against culture to something, the upside down kingdom. We're meant to disrupt that sense of power and some of those ties that hold us. He says at the bottom of that, basically new monasticism is dealing with isolation and how it relates to the public sphere. And it's basically saying it's being mediated by general morality. The last sentence or first sentence of the last paragraph, I said there's a number of subtle dimensions of this temptation. First, this is where I put CPC in. We must note that CPC does not exist in isolation from society, as a means of establishing pure community life. So in other words, what we're doing here is we're not trying to isolate ourselves to have some pure expression of community. Rather, CPC can exist in the midst of a society and live their lives in the midst of a society as the witness of the gospel. In other words, we can have a broader witness of who we are here. It's not about isolating ourselves in the town, but it's about making ourselves a shining proclamation so that everyone comes through this place. Every hiker that came through Lake City this year left knowing that the churches of Lake City gathered together to offer a meal to them for free with nothing in return, and they were celebrated. That's the gospel.
You never prayed with them?
No, because we don't need to pray with them.
But how do you know that they're going to get the message that they're going to take away the right message?
I don't have to be worried about that, because my measure is what we're doing faithful, and the answer is yes. And there's somewhere else where the challenges we look for. I think it was success.
I think in things like VBS, the idea is more, well, VBS is a little different. Let's say your games grew.
Yeah.
You don't make it about a message at all, and it isn't discussed, and you're setting an example of yourself. But how do they know who you are?
Well, it's easy for me because I'm a pastor. I mean, when you're a minister, and I have to name that because it is. The minute I sit down in a room and minister, there's a persona cast. I mean, as Presbyterians hanging out in conference hotels, bars, having a drink at night, talking to someone next to me, they're swearing up a storm, telling me things about their girlfriend or whatever, and then they're like, "So what do you do?" I'm like, "I'm a minister." But I genuinely believe that and I have someone in mind for person A who I play games with, who is not a Christian, who knows that I'm a Christian, who knows that I'm not trying to force Christianity on him, and I'm just loving him and being friends. And
Wow.
and then what he says, and then and is it my job to convert him?
No. But still, that's why you're doing it.
No, it's not actually.
So it's not intentional.
If he doesn't, If person A never accepts Christ, that's not me. I mean, it's not my job to change their mind. I'm proclaiming the gospel wherever I'm at. They experience Christ through me. If a door opens and that person says, "Hey, can I talk to you about something?" I'm not going to, also from a Christian perspective, this is reality, and then at some point the Spirit leads. Yeah.
Doesn't that go against the Great Commission? Go you into the nations and witness to the people and win them over to Christ?
But isn't it?
You are
defining what
witnessing.
witness is?
Yeah.
Well, it does not define what witness is.
Right.
Proclamation is usually the term. Proclaiming the gospel can happen in a lot of different ways.
Okay, so that creates a little bit of cognitive dissonance for me.
You're saying not saying anything.
Because
Yeah.
you're pretty traditional.
So, I pause this. I'll just let it record.
I mean, you understand what my point is.
I do, but I want to, I want to show you a movie clip, and there is one curse word in it. So I just have to,
Oh, like we've
do you want to see?
Yeah.
Is it is one of my favorite scenes, and again, I'm guessing which one it is, so I'm not, what's that?
Is it Simpson?
Okay, I'm gonna try this. And I don't even know if this is world playing. Let's see. Okay. Where's the volume? That's not it. I'll show you after. How about that? Because I'm like, oh no, it's gonna take forever for me to find this. I'm not sure when. I haven't pulled the clip up. I'll tell you about the clip, and if you want, I'll show it after, and I'll show you the contemporary video. Is that okay? Because it may take too long to find it. Little Miss Sunshine. Ever seen the movie?
Yes.
Little girl. She's a beauty pageant, atypical sort of child for a beauty pageant, and the parents are she's just whatever is doing and saying. Her brother Dwayne, or Dwight, I don't know what his name is wanting to be a fighter pilot, and they're on the way to the pageant. They're in their big VW van or whatever it is, and all of a sudden he says he can't. Something about it reveals that he can't see color. He's colorblind. He couldn't see a color. Oh, that's his color. That's color. What? But he wants to be a fighter pilot, and what his uncle says to him is, "Oh no, you can't be a fighter pilot if you're colorblind." So everything in this kid's world just shatters, and he starts screaming, "Let me out, let me out." And they pull over the side of this road, and it's in the middle of nowhere, kind of like, you're going up to Montrose or something, and it's just desert. And he gets out of the car and he runs down this hill, and he's just screaming the F word. One after the, and then they're like, what are we going to do? His life has just been destroyed. He's in this place of despair. The uncle, the parents, this little girl who's in these pageants are staring at the top of it, looking down and thinking, where do we, they're like, should you go down, uncle, you go down, dad, go down, what are you going to say, who's going to say what, how do we get him back up? The agenda was to get him back in the car so they could go on to their pageant. And in the midst of this big discussion, you see this little, girl who's not your beauty pageant sort of image walk down and sit next to her brother, and she puts her arm around her back. And she doesn't say a thing. And they just sit. And who knows, 30 seconds, 45 seconds goes on, his movie just sitting in silence. He says, okay. He picks her up and they walk up the hill. That is proclaiming the gospel, because it says, I'm not going to change you, but I'm going to dwell with you while you hurt. I'm going to dwell with you while you navigate this. We're going to be, even if there's no end result, the value of being with you in the moment. And this is what Andy Root argues, that Christ came in the incarnation. Yes, there was an agenda, but his agenda wasn't to win us over in that instance so that he would have, that was all God could move it however he wanted. His agenda was to die, but in the time that he got to spend with humanity, he dwelled with them. He sympathized with them. He related to them. And did most of them follow him in the end? Even the 12 that he considered his closest friends abandoned him in his hour of distress.
What do you also proclaim God? I mean, he did that a lot, but he also proclaimed, he taught.
Yes.
I mean, he did a full array of.
And we
proclamations.
proclaim on Sunday, and we proclaim, and there's a time and a place for everything, I mean,
Exactly,
that's,
there are many ways to proclaim.
we're in sacred time right now. This is sacred time. And we're proclaiming right now. We're wrestling with this proclamation. This is holy time. And that's why when I'm talking about sacred time, these are the things that we need to remember, that when we do these things, we're embracing this is a proclamation. And you have a conversation with someone tomorrow, the concept you're reading, you're talking about, that's proclamation. The problem is that in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, we made proclamations standing on a street corner, handing out a tract, giving someone the 4 spiritual laws, saying the sinner's prayer. We made it formulaic, and we reduced it to a transaction that made us feel good because we want a soul for God. And that is a complete bastardization of what the gospel calls us to, which is just proclamation.
But that answers discernment, knowing when to sit and dwell, when to hand out the tract, when to,
When to pray.
when to pray with someone. I mean,
Yes,
you have to have discernment. to know
Absolutely.
when to do these things.
and that would be cultivated within a community of faith. So,
There's really not a right answer.
no, because it's always situational. But the minute you go into a situation and put someone else ahead of yourself, it changes the entire dialogue and narrative. But that doesn't mean you can't meet with someone just for coffee who's not, and not think of it as, it doesn't mean everything. I don't think it means every second of your day has to be consumed by proclamation.
Right.
But I do think that we also show glory to God when we embrace the things we do every day normally. I do think that we, in maybe ways that we're not looking like we're making that proclamation. We make that proclamation.
The way you're explaining it, though, that you can be experiencing the gospel without ever mentioning the word. You can spend your whole life like that and never go to church.
You could, and I don't think that has an effect on one's salvation. You still be a follower of Christ and live that life. It may not be the most faithful. And I think that's the difference. I wrote the church, and then on the back pages we'll come to it. The church has to choose whether the church wants to either survive, succeed. It's like some churches are just like, let's just do what we have to do just to sort of live. Another church is like, well, how do we succeed as a church? Well, we build bigger buildings, we get bigger offerings, we get more people, we get bigger programs, we have bigger outreach, we have bigger.
That's the power approach.
That's claiming, that's the struggle that I have a little bit with Young Life. Young Life sometimes goes into a school, and I've seen happen time and time again, and they'll say, where are the cool kids? Let's draw the cool kids. Let's make it an attractional model of the church, so then we have social power. When many of you know I was fired from my job when I didn't come here 10 years ago to another job. You gotta go.
No, I do, but go ahead. I love the story.
Well, I don't know if it's the same story,
Oh.
but one of the critiques that they had, I've spent my life doing youth ministry from the age of 14. And so, I'm finished 4 years doing a PhD on youth, young adult spirituality, go to this big church, I'm ministering to these kids. And because I was accused that I didn't like young people, because there were certain people in the church who had kids who were the cool crowd, and that all the other leaders flocked around and attended to, that I would say, hey, how you doing? And then I would go seek out the kid who was sitting on the side of on the wall, who was the skater, who was the goth kid who just was there. And I would go sit down next to him, and I would ask him how the week was, and I'd spend that talking. That's the upside down kingdom. And I was persecuted for that. And I was criticized for that, but I would never do, I was taught when I was young to go, when I go to the cafeteria at school, and you can choose between a group of your friends that you're going to see later at church, or that kid who's sitting alone. You go to the kid sitting alone and say, can I sit with you? And that is the gospel. Never mentioning I'm a Christian, never inviting him to, maybe an opportunity to come to invite him to church. But in that moment, the goal was not to make him a Christian. The goal was to meet his need of loneliness and to just be with him, and to know that that's a part of our condition. Amen. Real quickly, and this will round up quickly now here, and I know it's near to go. He kind of on 42 argues against sectarianism. basically, this page kind of we're halfway through, second paragraph. One of the fragmentations that new monastic communities, or we could say that we as the church are facing, is healing is seek healing for it is the belief that the life in Jesus Christ is characterized as a private personal realm, and the life in the public realm is ruled by something separate from our life in Christ, such as a general or shared concept of justice. And this is a case where sometimes the church gets so caught up in being validated. And sometimes we do that through the attractional model. Sometimes we do that through social justice initiatives. Sometimes we do that through popular figures and crossover books and music. We justify our existence because we want to be a controlling agent in society. And so basically the thing he's talking about in all of this sense, if you can't reduce it to morality, because if you reduce everything in society to how we know what is right and wrong, and it's in a Nietzschean society, then it's fragmented and we'll never find any sense of unity. We'll always be divided. And so what he's arguing for, ultimately, what we'll argue in the next chapter, is we need to find unity, a place of unity and a place to locate that tradition. And he acknowledges that he doesn't name what it is. We switch over to the second temptation, and I'll go through, I think I can summarize this much quicker. The will to power is a struggle for power. We see that in politics. Holy cow, did we see that in politics in the last election? Everyone's Christians, everyone's arguing for they're under, and this goes back to the idea, like maybe we should just jettison our affiliations, not that we can still vote parties, but have we given political parties too much power as Christians in this nation by saying we'll give you our undying allegiance? Not we'll give you, well, we may vote for you because we think you're the best expression of our understanding of your faith, but still that's a Nietzschean reaction to that emotional how we feel, but we'll still give you that, or because you meet something within us, and that sense of allegiance then supersedes that morality that McIntyre is saying needs to be at the base of all Christianity, which goes back to before the Enlightenment. He highlights, since the Enlightenment project on morality has failed, saying it didn't work out because we're fragmented, we're all left with an emotivist morality. That is, the moral statements are not merely statements of feeling and emotion disguised as statements of, that is, moral statements are merely statements of feeling or emotion disguised as statements of fact or statements of value derived from fact. Holy cow, does that just not name everything we have watched on television over the last few years? No matter what you see, people or Facebook, someone's own opinion about something is being stated as if it's fact. And I don't necessarily blame them, because in many ways we're raising an environment where people, your experience is fact. But this is the challenge of living in an isolated world where we're looking at things in these small little clusters, because we don't take into account the society or the culture or the families that we're in, even the church family.
Is this what's behind this strong movement amongst evangelicals for religious liberty?
The freedoms, you mean?
Yeah, protecting religious liberty when people are really thinking that Christian liberties have been challenged, like
I think there are a couple of things there. I think one is just the fear of too much government control, which honestly, I think both sides of the spectrum really fear that in different ways for different reasons. No, but I think the notion of Christian liberties also comes out of a fragment of the gospel and is often protected in the name of the ideal behind it, not one that doesn't necessarily trace its way back purely to the gospel.
Oh, this movement's like, we want prayer in our schools. We want to be able.
Well, that's a validation of prayer over an entire society. And again, that's sort of saying that I want my morality as a Christian, how I understand it, to be everyone else's. And so it's commingling Christianity or faith belief with societal standards. And what he's saying is that's not what it was meant to be. In particular, unless those people share your convictions. You can develop a moral basis when you share some convictions, but if you don't share convictions, then you're adhering to something. And I think what he's arguing about is that at some point, those things then they just become blind adherence. They're not internalized, which is what he'll deal in the next chapter. There are virtues that are internalized in us. And then so the rest of this page on 43 is that the church adopts this will to power. We try to do this. We try to hold on to power in society and control and influence, and a desire for that. The next page, I had some serious issues on this page. I don't agree with the first two paragraphs at all. I wrote some commentary. But the second paragraph, the third paragraph where it says secondly, second sentence down, these movements, and he's talking about new monastic movements, do not rise out of a desire to survive and succeed, but out of a desire to be faithful. The focus for these communities is on God, not the world, on faithfulness, not success, and on the weakness and the foolishness of following the crucified Messiah, not gaining power in the world. And when we look at what Jesus did, he disrupted the power, not by expressing more power, but by flipping that whole paradigm upside down. And I think and the desire that we should have is not to, and this is why when I was hired and the search committee were like, maybe young families will be attracted to church because I'm young. And that's a desire for success or perceived success or growth because we feel good about that growth. Whereas what we're focusing on now is not how do we get people in, but how do we be the church? How do we most faithfully be the church? The Taizé community draws over 100,000 pilgrims a year, to 6,000 in some of those weeks in the suburbs. That's a massive amount of people who come to this place. And their focus has always been not how are we most successful, but how are we most faithful? So when I wrote my dissertation about them and wanted at the end to kind of create a sort of tier of connection or membership to the Taizé community, they said absolutely not, and they didn't want me to publish it, and that's why it's not published today. I never got around to changing it, but because they know that overnight they could have a denomination of over 100,000 strong, because these young people who are wanderers would affiliate themselves. And they would be one of the fastest growing denominations in Europe. It would be an ecumenical movement. And they say, no, that's not what we're called to. We're called to be faithful in what we're doing. We're showing hospitality. We're doing local mission. We're traveling to impoverished parts of the country. We have brothers in impoverished parts of the country working with them. So that sense of the question that I ask is not what will make us more successful, but how do we faithfully live this out? When I was 19 or 20, I think that was different. When I was 24, I went to the UK and started a youth ministry program called Big Fish. Got t-shirts, a big gymnasium, got a big bouncy castle, 150 kids overnight. That was a huge success, according to the world standards. But it wasn't a faithful expression of ministry. And I'm not even sure that I had the intent to have it be an expression of my love of neighbor or of God. It was more like, I know how to draw a big crowd and get them in, and sure, we preach the gospel and proclaim the gospel, but not in a way that actually, I think, will actually change lives. Final page, he sort of just hitting on the power of social sciences, and he kind of makes an argument against them. And as a practical theologian, I kind of take it somewhat of an issue with him because I rely on social sciences to understand Christian phenomena. And I found that has been very fruitful for me to analyze what I'm doing, why I'm doing all those sort of things. But I do want to, and so I think that he's a little off on that, but he is saying you can rely on it a little bit. He makes the notion that modesty is a virtue that we've lost. It's true even in churches and seminaries where modesty and unpretentiousness are rarely exemplified. In other words, we don't take the virtues of eras past and hold those up. We actually exalt things that are probably more vices or things out of balance. Halfway down, or the last sentence of the second paragraph, there is a great temptation and power and control promised by the social sciences to provide the resources for the church to regain its place of influence in society. So we look to family systems theory, we look to church organization growth theory, we look to psychological theory. We try to use worldly wisdom to make our churches more successful. And what he's trying to say is like, that's just misguided. And it really comes down to a small communities of people saying, what is it to express the gospel where we're at? And that's why this hiker meal is taken off, I think, is because we feel it. we're proclaiming the gospel. We're doing something that matters. We're experiencing the good. And we're seeing, and we're desiring to do it better. The fact that I've had have a half a dozen people are saying to me, hey, I'd like to house, if I can house a hiker, if hikers don't have a place to stay, I can have it. That's an act of, that's an act of proclamation of the gospel. I mean, hikers are blown away by what's happening here. It's something like they've never received. And honestly, the fact that they've been hiking for 300 and something miles and had all this time to be by themselves and introspective, their encounter of a community that is clapping for them and taking them up to the front of the line and asking if they need stuff and just wanting to bless them for no reason. We're never going to see them again. We're never going to get a tithe from them. We're never going to get them to fold a bulletin or whatever it might be. We're just loving them because that's what Christ calls.
I guarantee you, they will share that with other people.
Well, how does that make them better people? I mean, how, do you think this changes anything about them?
I think that it gives young people hope.
What about all the old people?
Well, I think, I think the old people are probably jaded in themselves and they can get through that. But young people who have a very negative view of faith communities, I mean, one of them that said this feels like the church.
And gratitude.
And
Unbelievable.
is it going to save them? No, but that's not my job. That's not your job. We don't have to do that.
Well,
If they've never met, maybe they're not supposed to. I don't, maybe not.
if we're in favor of organized religion, churches meeting together, and we would hope that that others would too, right? Maybe not our church, but some way to gather this way, as opposed to gathering because you like to walk or something like that. And I just wonder if any of them, if it changes any of them in that way.
I think it does. I don't think we can necessarily calculate it. The amount I have interviewed over 500 and something pilgrims that have gone to say. And they go there because and one of the main reasons they go there is because they experience a true sense of Sabbath, and they use this language of euphoria or paradise or utopia. It's this characterized expression of God's kingdom, where you just feel loved, you feel embraced, you feel, and you can be as different as one another could possibly be, from countries and languages and political, like really as diverse as you possibly, 40 some different languages or 40 some different nations there in any given week. But they come for spiritual seeking, and they find this sense of dwelling. And when they leave, yes, they participate in some actions that were transformative to them, but they leave and they carry the spirit of it's possible. And I think kids that, people who leave and have distaste or distrust for the church will leave here. And if they do, they leave here saying, wow, the churches in Lake City are showing love in ways that I've never experienced. I mean, now, granted, they're kind of primed for it because they're hiking. But I think that encounter does give hope. And here's the thing, we don't know. I mean, how many memories do you have in your head of things that have happened in your past where God has held that memory in your head and you go back to it, where you experienced something different and it changed your sense of what was possible? And for a young person or old person or whoever it might be who says, I've given up on the church, it's not a place I want to be, to walk into a place and to have no agenda, no prayer, to be served, to be cared for, to be loved, and to be sent off. I mean, that we don't know. And I guess it's not my job to, that's why I think proclamation is proclamation.
Right, it's not up to us. If God will use, if we're faithful, God uses it.
And it could be 10 years down the road.
Right.
Maybe they just got warm, fuzzy feelings. Maybe they just filled their belly. But you know what? There were folks in that 5,000 that probably didn't follow Jesus, but got a meal from him from that day. And that's faithful. And that's why I think that's why I think the biggest myth of the church is, I don't think faithful living is hard. I think it needs to be intentional. And I think we have, as a church, have taken our place in society for granted, and we assume who we are and the role we play. And maybe it's time that we, in this new era of the world, in particular after COVID, we're going to see it. We're going to see a hemorrhaging of the church across the board. We're already seeing it. Pastors are like, how are we going to afford an associate pastor? We're facing it here. We were once a 120 plus strong congregation in the summer that sustained that. Quite frankly, I mentioned that sustained a full-time pastor. Well, in 10 years, we may not be. Maybe we'll be running a coffee shop out of here to sustain the ministry. Maybe we'll be I don't know. Who knows? So, but we don't have to know what it's in 10 years, because if we have our minds in spiritual matters, then what we do on earth is every day is say, this day is given to God.
And develop empathy for where the needs are.
Oh, absolutely.
I think is, the old saying, if we build it, they will come. If we have empathy for hurting or struggling people, we'll be able to minister.
And this is the challenge that we have in here, because we're in a retirement community and we have a very small population here. Most people don't, most people are surviving. No one's really, I don't think not that there aren't struggles here. Food bank is used and we're growing food begin next year so that we can, those are all good things. But we live in this weird little town where there's not like the same issues that if you go up to Gunnison or Montrose or Denver, you're going to face in the same way. We don't have homeless people walking around. We have
But there are
hikers.
needs.
But there are needs.
Because we're older people, there are more health needs.
Yeah.
And there are more people who are losing loved ones
Yeah.
because we're in that
And
generation.
those are things that we ought to be mindful of and caring for one another. And this is what I said this before. I would love that when you leave and go back to Denver, Yeah. Morrison, whatever, Denver, Georgia Stalkers. And when you leave and go back, I want you to feel like I'm missing out on what's happening.
Oh, I always do.
No, but not even in the sense of the social aspects of that the life of our faith community is so rich and so encouraging and nurturing and glorifying to God that it's like when I'm in Lake City, I'm in Sabbath, I'm in paradise, I'm in holy time. And when I leave and I hit those gates, it's not just seeing the town and the fun and then people but there's something deep in your soul that says it's time to be fed.
But that's one of the issues I have with him, because he's so critical of the church. And I think there are pockets of new monasticism all over, where people have responded to God's call to love their neighbor. And they do it out of a motive of serving God. And there are programs all over this country where people are doing good things. And he talks in this chapter about modesty. And so you don't hear about those little efforts sometimes, but they are reaching out.
Yes. And I did make a point of that. There's so many little things that are happening. They're faithful. It's kind of like Princess Diana. We see her hanging out with the lepers or whatever it was, and we praise her. Well, she can fly around the world in a moment's notice. Like it's, she gets all this. She's at the. I'm not down on Diana. What I'm saying is there were a lot of other people ministering to the lepers long before Diana came in, and long after, and they're the unsung heroes. But they're the ones who, through practice, live out their beliefs every day.